Hello, and thank you for joining me for another video. So today we're going to look at doing endpoint compliance with the FortiNAC persistent agent. So let's have a quick look at what we have here. So we have a FortiGate with a trunk port to a Forti switch. Let's just refresh that connection. Okay, so here's my Forti switch. I have, if I go to the switch, if I go to the interfaces, and I look at this port, okay, so this is the trunk port, so that's its native VLAN, and these are the two VLANs that are allowed on that trunk. Now, you may ask why I'm using the switch in standalone mode. The switch is not being managed by the FortiGate. As you can see here, I've got no managed switches. Purely because in a lot of customer environments, the customers may be using a different vendor's switch, or they may be using standalone switches, or there could be many reasons why they would want to use a standalone switch. And so I decided to use this for the basis of the demonstration. But it could quite easily have been with a managed FortiGate. Neither here nor there. Come along to the FortiNAC itself now. If we look under the inventory, all right, and this is where you put your various offices and the switches, or so if I look here, I've got this is a managed one. Here I've got a FortiGate 2600 with a whole raft of switches and a couple of APs managed by it. But in this particular one, I have the one in question, I just have this single switch. So port 2 here is the trunk port going up to the FortiGate. Ports 1 and 3, for no good reason, are where my hosts reside. All right, so the host in question, which is going to be this Windows machine, is on switch 3, on port 3 here. All right, now all the ports that are going to be subject to FortiNAC control have their default VLAN set as VLAN 166, which is my isolation VLAN. And by default, if a port has not got an authenticated device connected to it, it gets placed its current VLAN. This is the window here, this section here, current VLAN is the one that dynamically changes. And as you can see, default and current VLAN match on both sides here because the user is not currently authenticated to the device. Now, what I have done is I have installed FortiClient on the endpoint, because FortiClient is going to be the, I'm going to use antivirus as the compliance check to ascertain whether or not the security posture of the machine is valid. And in addition to that, I also have the client here, the FortiNAC persistent client. And you can see a couple of messages here from previous things that I've done. Now, for that to work, the most important thing, because it has a SSL connection, is we have to make sure that the certificates are valid. All right, so I'm not going to go into this because this is meant to be a quick video, but it's all in the documentation. So just follow the documentation in terms of creating the relevant certificates. At the moment, I'm using a self-signed certificate for the persistent agent. Clearly, I wouldn't recommend you do that. Please, create a CSR, certificate signing request, upload that to your relevant certificate authority, and have them come back with a valid, and then you can upload the relevant certificate to this section. If we go along here to endpoint compliance now, so this is where we now create our checks. So what I've got here is I've got two different checks based on the profile that the machine is in at any one time. So this particular user that I'm going to be using is going to be part of the human resources team. But should they fail compliancy check, they'll get dropped into the isolation VLAN, right? So if I look at my compliancy check, it says here, so what do? One, I want to collect my application inventory. This is important because we can use the endpoint client to keep a track record of what is installed on machines and actually use that information in other rules later on. But for now, we're just going to be doing an antivirus check. And then I can say, well, what happens upon pass and fail? So here, if I say, if the scan passes, or then put the user in the HR role, which is assigned to a VLAN. If it fails, put it in the isolation, which is back to VLAN 166. And what is the scan I want to run? In this case, it's the AV check scan. And this is that scan. So I say every time this machine connects, scan. Now you can see here we've got different agents. All right. I'm only focusing on the persistent agent in this video. I will do other videos at a later stage for the other agents. And then we can say, well, what happens in the case of a failure? And then we can have other steps occur here as well. If I look at the categories, and there's different categories that you can choose from here, all right? But as I said, at the moment, I'm just using antivirus, and we've got a plethora of antivirus engines that we can use here to check against, all right? But obviously, this is FortiNAC, so I'm going to use the FortiClient. Just cancel that, all right? So now we're ready to go. As I said, if I look at my hosts here, this host is here, but it's not actually logged on. All right, so it is, if I go to policy details here, it says it can't find anything because it's discovered that the machine is there through the DHCP request that it originally used. So, sorry, I didn't mention that. If I look at my interfaces here, I have got my branch, which is the VLAN that the user will be placed in once they've correctly authenticated. But here's the isolation VLAN, and the isolation VLAN is set DHCP relay so that when the user logs in, they get an IP address from FortiNAC itself. FortiNAC is actually running a DHCP server. Now, the FortiNAC uses that to discover that one, a new machine has connected, and two, it looks at other parameters within the DHCP request, like DHCP fingerprinting, to make a first pass guess as to what that machine might be. It can then go through a more accurate profiling using the device profiling rules. And again, I'm not going to go deep into these because it's outside of the scope of this particular video. But as you can see here, there's a whole raft of rules, and you can get as robust and creative as you wish here in terms of, we've got 17 different methods here that you can use to go and detect what the type of device is, in addition to the DHCP fingerprinting. So for very accurate assessment. But you will have seen that when I went to the host here, it already saw that this is a Windows machine. Right, so I'm just going to come back here to the network inventory. And not only is the FortiNAC running a DHCP server, but it's also acting as the DNS, right? So it's doing DNS interception. So if I now do fortinet.com here, for example, then what happens is, because it intercepts that DNS request, it redirects it to the captive portal of the FortiNAC, which means that I can now authenticate users without the need of 802.1x. I'm not using any 802.1x here. FortiNAC fully supports .1x, but it's not the default methodology. The default is to use this captive portal. Once the user has registered, they only have to ever register once. After that, the FortiNAC persistent agent will do the re-registration of users every single time they connect to the network, and will reassess their security posture and assign them the relevant policies based on that security posture. So now I'm going to log in. I've got this user already cached, and I'm going to choose what group they belong to, and I'm going to say continue. And now if we come back here and we just refresh this page, we can see that the user is now registered. That port has now gone down. Why has it gone down? Because it's changing the VLAN to VLAN 201, which is the correct for the HR. All right, and the purpose of bouncing the port like this is so that the machine obviously gets a new IP address. Now, in my environment here, I'm using a VM Windows machine, a VM switch, and of course they're not directly connected, so they may or may not refresh the IP address. Just have a look, otherwise I'll have to manually just do a renew. So now that user is connected. All right, we can see more information about that user now. I can look at the policy. It's not on this page. If I come back here and I go to my hosts, and now just refresh that, and I look at policy details, I can now see that that user has now got a profile and a policy associated with them, because they now are effectively a valid machine that has passed security compliance checking. So if I come back to my networks, my inventory, my spoke, well, that's refreshing itself. Let's just close that, and now I should be able to get to fortinet.com, which I can. All right, which means that this IP address has updated. You see the original one was in the 166 VLAN. If I look at it now, it should be in 172.168, which it is. So life is good. The machine has checked that FortiClient was running. It has authenticated that user. It's done the security posture, endpoint compliance validation, and it's deemed the machine to be compliant and it's put it into the correct VLAN. So let's go along to the rule here, and let's change that rule. Let's go to the scan, and we'll change it to a different antivirus. All right, so let's go to my Windows, and let us change that to FProt. We'll click OK. Now, this is on a schedule, but just to hurry things along, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to manually scan. All right, now there you go. So it's detected that FProt is not installed, and it is reconfiguring this back to the isolation VLAN now. So if I come along here, back to my inventory, switch 1. Okay, I'm back to VLAN 166. So the machine is no longer compliant. Take it off the network dynamically, because we don't want dodgy machines on the network or any questionable behavior on the network. So we remediate that by putting them back into the isolation VLAN, henceforth protecting other users on the network from things like ransomware. Okay, so let's just see if it has changed the IP address. So I'm just going to force a renew there, because, as I mentioned, because I'm using a VM. So let's just get that IP address back to the 192.166 VLAN. Which it's done. All right. Now, I remember what I said. I do not have to log back in again. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to change that back to FortiClient. Okay. And let me just run that scan again. In fact, let's just scan host, and there we go. All right, as I said, I'm just being impatient here. It would have run the scan on the schedule, but I was just hurrying it along. So you can set the schedule for whatever you want. I think I've got mine set to 60 seconds. It's purely up to you. The FortiNAC is very, very flexible and very configurable. So you can customize it to whatever suits your organization. So if I look back here now, let's just see if it's changed the IP address. No, let's just refresh that again. Renew. Okay, so I've got my IP address back, and I can get to the outside world again. So hopefully that was useful. If there's any questions regarding the persistent agent, please get a hold of your relevant SE, who will be able to answer any outstanding questions you may have. Thank you very much for your time.